Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, February 19, 1943. The sound arrives first. It is not the familiar crack of rifle fire or the stutter of a machine gun. It is a physical presence, a deep, grinding growl that vibrates up from the rocky soil into the bones of a man's feet. It is a sound of immense weight, of methodical, unstoppable power. It is the sound of German steel. For the men of the American 1st Armored Division, crouched in shallow scrapes of earth and rock, this is a new kind of fear. They are boys from Ohio and Texas, barely 3 months out of the United States, fed a diet of confidence and newsreel victories. They have been told they are the best equipped army in the world. Now, in this sun-bleached, wind-scoured pass in North Africa, they are learning the truth. The growl becomes a visible thing. 3 shapes, then 4, crest a low ridge 1,000 yards away. They are not the light, almost flimsy tanks the Americans have trained against. These are Panzer Kampfwagen IVs. They are wide, low-slung, and malevolent. Their long 75mm cannons sniffing the air like the proboscis of some predatory insect. They move with an arrogant slowness, their tracks churning the dry earth into plumes of yellow dust. They do not look like machines. They look like a species of creature for which the American soldiers have no natural defense. The order comes down the line, a ripple of shouting voices. 37 mil, up front. A small gun crew, 5 men who look impossibly young, wrestle their weapon into position. The M3 37mm anti-tank gun, the Army's official answer to enemy armor. On the firing ranges in Georgia, it had seemed a potent and elegant weapon. Here, under the vast, indifferent Tunisian sky, it looks like a child's toy. The Panzers continue their advance, closing the distance with terrifying speed. 800 yards, 700. The gun commander, a sergeant with sweat tracing clean lines through the grime on his face, screams a command. The gun cracks, a sharp, angry bark. The tiny shell vanishes into the shimmering heat. A bright spark flashes harmlessly against the thick, sloped frontal plate of the lead Panzer. It is like throwing a rock at a battleship. The German tank does not even slow down. The Panzer's turret traverses, a slow, deliberate movement that is somehow more terrifying than speed. There is a bloom of orange-black smoke from the end of its long cannon. The air splits with a sound like tearing linen, a supersonic crack that passes overhead an instant before the boom of the gun arrives. The shell, a high-explosive round, lands 20 feet short of the American gun pit. The world erupts in a fountain of rock and fire. 2 of the crew are simply gone, erased. The others are shredded, their bodies thrown like dolls. The gun itself is a twisted wreck of smoking metal. The American infantrymen watch this casual, instantaneous execution in stunned silence. Their own weapons are useless. The .30 caliber machine guns send streams of tracers that bounce off the Panzer's hides like angry hornets. Their M1 rifles are pop guns. Their grenades are firecrackers. They have nothing. The official doctrine has failed in the first 30 seconds of contact. This is the impossible problem. The Panzer is not just a weapon, it is a system, a combined arms predator of infantry, artillery, and Stuka dive bombers all working in concert. And the American soldier, the individual GI, has been left out of the equation. He has been told that killing tanks is someone else's job, the job of a specialized gun crew or a tank destroyer battalion that is miles away, stuck in a traffic jam. In the moment of truth, when the steel monster is grinding toward his foxhole, the American infantryman is expected to do one of 3 things: run, hide, or die. The system has decreed him to be bait. But this is not a story about a failing system. It is the story of how that system was broken by an idea born not in a boardroom, but in a cluttered workshop. It is the story of a weapon that ordnance officers considered a joke, a bizarre contraption of scrap metal and electrical wiring that looked more like a plumber's nightmare than a tool of war. The Germans would see it for the first time on a battlefield in Sicily and laugh, calling it the Ofenrohr, the stovepipe, a toy. This is the story of how that toy, in the hands of a single, terrified soldier, would turn the hunter into the hunted and change the nature of infantry combat forever. To understand the stovepipe, you must first understand the crisis it was born to solve. The American entry into the European War in late 1942 was a shock to a system built on theory. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, was the United States Army's first major contest against the German Wehrmacht. It was a baptism by fire, and the water was scalding. The army that landed in Morocco and Algeria was an army built for a different war. It was green, road-bound, and dangerously overconfident, its commanders still thinking in terms of the neat, predictable battlefields of World War I. They were about to be taught a brutal lesson in modern warfare by Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. The German way of war was a fluid, violent symphony of maneuver and firepower. They did not attack in straight lines, they flowed like water, seeking the path of least resistance, using their tanks not as infantry support but as a mailed fist to shatter the enemy's weakest point and sow chaos in their rear. The established Allied solution to this threat was a doctrine of layered static defense. At the very front of this defense was the 37mm gun. It was a light, tidy weapon that could, in theory, be moved around a battlefield by its crew. It had performed well against the paper-thin armor of Japanese tanks in the Pacific. Against the welded, hardened steel plate of a Panzer IV, it was tragically, fatally outmatched. The Germans, with their typical black humor, nicknamed it the Pak 36, the door knocker. All it could do was announce its presence before being obliterated. The next layer of defense was the tank destroyer force. This was a uniquely American concept, a new branch of the army created specifically to counter the German blitzkrieg. It was a force of mobile, aggressive tank hunters, equipped with more powerful guns mounted on fast, lightly armored chassis. The theory was that these tank destroyer battalions would be held in reserve, a powerful fist to be thrown at any German armored breakthrough. This is where the doctrine collapsed into bloody failure. The reality of combat was not a neat chessboard. The tank destroyers were rarely in the right place at the right time. Communications broke down, roads became clogged. The Germans did not break through in one convenient, obvious location. They punched a dozen small holes, their panzers swarming through the gaps, isolating and destroying the American infantry units one by one. By the time the tank destroyers arrived, the battle was often already lost. The front line was not a line at all. It was a porous, bleeding membrane, and the infantryman was the one left to face the armored onslaught alone and effectively unarmed. The institutional arrogance that created this disaster was centered in the powerful, conservative world of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. This was the institution responsible for designing, testing, and procuring every weapon the American soldier carried, from his boots to his artillery. It was an old and proud organization, dominated by engineers and ballistics experts who believed in a rigid set of physical laws. Their gospel was muzzle velocity. The way to kill a tank was to hit it with a heavy piece of metal, a solid shot, traveling at an extremely high speed. This required a long barrel, a large powder charge, and a heavy, stable gun platform. War was a problem of physics, and the solution was more energy. The idea of giving an infantryman a weapon capable of killing a tank was, to the men of ordnance, a contradiction in terms. The physics were all wrong. A rifle could not be made powerful enough. A grenade thrown by hand could not carry a large enough explosive charge. They had tried. Before the war, they had developed the M10 grenade, a clumsy, finned contraption that was fired from a launcher attached to the muzzle of a standard M1 Garand rifle. It was a failure. Its shaped charge warhead was too small to penetrate German armor. Its recoil was so violent it was known to break soldiers' shoulders, and its effective range was barely 50 yards, a suicidal distance for a man standing in the open in front of a tank's machine guns. The failure of the M10 grenade did not inspire a search for a new solution. It reinforced the Ordnance Department's core belief that the problem was unsolvable. The infantryman was simply not the right tool for the job. Tanks would be killed by other tanks, and by big, powerful anti-tank guns. The role of the foot soldier was to hold the ground in between and to try not to die while the real weapons did their work. They were men of the slide rule and the proving ground, and their calculations had proven, to their satisfaction, that a man-portable tank killer was a fantasy. They were looking for an answer in the laws of kinetics, in the brute force of a speeding projectile. The real answer was waiting in a different discipline entirely: chemistry. The ticking clock was pounding. The debacle at Kasserine Pass was a wake-up call, a strategic humiliation that sent shockwaves all the way back to Washington. But there was no time for a wholesale rethinking of doctrine. The invasion of Sicily was just 5 months away. After Sicily would come the long, brutal slog up the Italian peninsula, a landscape of mountains and narrow roads perfect for defensive armored warfare. And looming over all of it was the ultimate objective: Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. The American army was about to face the full might of the German Panzerwaffe, not the worn-out remnants of the Afrika Korps, but dozens of elite, battle-hardened SS Panzer divisions. They would be fighting in the hedgerow country of Normandy, a maze of small fields and sunken lanes that was an infantryman's nightmare and a tanker's paradise. Every hedgerow could hide a panzer, every field was a potential killing ground. If the American army could not solve the problem of the lone soldier versus the tank, the invasion of Europe would be a bloodbath on an unimaginable scale. The entire strategic plan for defeating Germany rested on the assumption that Allied infantry, backed by air power and artillery, could take and hold ground against German armor. The disaster in North Africa had shown that assumption to be dangerously, catastrophically false. The system was failing. The doctrine was a lie. And the men in charge of finding a new weapon, the powerful officers of the Ordnance Department, were convinced that no such weapon could exist. The search for the impossible had already been tried, and it had failed. The answer was not waiting at the front lines. It was gathering dust on a shelf in a laboratory at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It existed in the mind of a man who was not a soldier, and it would be championed by an officer who was not a general. The hero of this story was not a person, but a partnership, a collision of two obscure figures operating on the forgotten fringes of the American war machine. The first was Captain Leslie A. Skinner. He was an ordnance officer, but a peculiar one. He did not fit the mold. Where his colleagues were disciples of the gun, of kinetic energy and the brute force of the cannon, Skinner was a heretic. He was a rocket man. In the pre-war army, this was akin to being an alchemist. Rockets were viewed with deep suspicion by the ordnance establishment. They were inaccurate, their propellant was dangerously unstable, and they were considered little more than glorified fireworks. They were messy, they were unpredictable, they lacked the mathematical purity of a bullet. Skinner's fascination with them had marked him as an eccentric, a man pursuing a technological dead end. He was a voice in the wilderness, filing reports on solid fuel propellants that were politely read and quietly filed away. He was a low-status visionary in an institution that despised vision. The second man was Edward Uhl, a young civilian engineer working for the ordnance contractor General Electric. Uhl was a problem solver, a tinkerer. He was not burdened by military doctrine. He did not know what was considered impossible. His world was one of circuits and stress tolerances, of finding the elegant solution to a practical problem. He had been assigned to the dead-end project of improving the M10 shaped charge rifle grenade, the weapon that was proving to be a suicidal failure on the battlefield. Their paths crossed in the spring of 1942, in the sprawling, windswept complex of Aberdeen, a place of constant, deafening noise, of test firing and controlled explosions. Uhl was frustrated. He held in his hands a miracle of chemistry that was trapped inside a fatally flawed delivery system. This was the M6A3 shaped charge grenade. It was a small, finned cylinder of sheet metal, but inside it lay a principle of physics so potent it bordered on magic. The Monroe effect. Discovered in the 1880s, the principle of the shaped charge was elegantly simple. By shaping a block of high explosive into a cone, with the hollow part facing the target, the blast of the detonation was not dissipated in all directions. It was focused into a single, narrow, hypervelocity jet of molten metal and gas, a plasma blowtorch that could reach temperatures of thousands of degrees and travel at over 25,000 feet per second. This jet did not punch its way through steel with brute force. It melted its way through, instantly vaporizing a path through the thickest armor plate, spraying the interior of the tank with a shotgun blast of molten steel and spall. All knew the warhead worked. In static tests, it could burn a neat, circular hole through inches of armor. The problem was getting it to the target. Fired from a rifle, it was wildly inaccurate beyond 50 yards, and the recoil was brutal. As a hand-thrown grenade, it was useless. A soldier could not throw it hard enough or far enough to be effective. The miracle was a prisoner of physics. It had a warhead, but it had no engine. This was the eureka moment. It was not a flash of lightning. It was a moment of quiet, desperate improvisation on a firing range. A group of senior ordnance officers had gathered for yet another demonstration of a new and supposedly improved rifle grenade launcher. The test was a dismal failure. The grenades wobbled in flight, landing far from the target tank hulk that sat baking in the Maryland sun. The generals were impatient, their faces set in grim, disappointed lines. The whole concept was a dead end. Skinner was there, observing from the sidelines. Uhl was there, holding one of his M6A3 grenades, feeling the familiar sting of failure. He was looking at the small, finned projectile in his hand. And then he looked over at the other side of the range, where Captain Skinner's team was preparing a test of a small experimental smoke rocket. It was a simple tube that fired a small, fin-stabilized projectile. The two dead ends suddenly collided in Uhl's mind. He walked over to Skinner. He held up the grenade. He asked the captain if it would be possible to put a rocket motor on the back of this, to turn the grenade into a self-propelled projectile. Skinner looked at the grenade. He saw the fins. He saw the cone-shaped warhead. He understood the problem of its delivery. And then he looked at his own rockets. His rockets had an engine, but they had no purpose. Uhl's grenade had a purpose, but no engine. It was a lock and a key lying on opposite sides of a room. In that moment, two heresies combined to form a revolutionary new gospel. The Ordnance Department had dismissed the shaped charge because its low velocity made it useless in a conventional cannon. And it had dismissed the rocket because of its inaccuracy. But a rocket did not need a heavy cannon barrel, and a shaped charge did not need high velocity to work. Its power came from chemistry, not kinetics. The rocket was the perfect delivery system for the one warhead that did not care about speed. It was a perfect symbiotic relationship between two technologies that the established leadership had declared individually useless. They were looking at a weapon that, according to their own physics, should not exist. The idea was immediately dismissed. Skinner and Ull took their concept up the chain of command. They were met with a wall of institutional inertia and outright ridicule. A rocket? Fired by an infantryman? They were told it was a fantasy. The propellant was too dangerous. The weapon would be too heavy. It would be impossible for a soldier to aim. The backblast from the rocket motor would roast the man firing it. The official reports came back stamped with disapproval. It was an unsound and impractical concept. The ordnance men went back to their work on bigger guns and faster bullets, secure in their belief that they had, once again, defended the laws of physics from the foolishness of amateurs. But the news from North Africa was getting worse. The reports of the 37mm gun's failure were no longer rumors. They were official, bloody communiques. The letters from the front were filled with a desperate plea for a weapon, any weapon that could give the lone soldier a fighting chance against a Panzer. The system was failing, and the men in the field were paying the price in blood. This was the catalyst. Skinner and Ull, driven by the urgency of the reports and the sting of their official rejection, broke the rules. They did not have authorization. They did not have a budget. What they had was a junk pile. In a forgotten corner of the Aberdeen workshops, they began to build their unauthorized prototype. This was not a product of a state-of-the-art design bureau. It was an act of battlefield engineering, conducted thousands of miles from any battle. The new invention was a masterpiece of scavenger-found simplicity. The launch tube was a piece of scrap steel pipe they reclaimed from a salvage yard, a tube that had once been the casing for a thermite bomb. It was 60 inches long and weighed almost nothing. For a sighting mechanism, they improvised, taking a simple iron sight from a discarded rifle. The firing mechanism was a work of pure, unadulterated tinkering. They took a battery and some wiring from a derelict field telephone. They fashioned a simple trigger and a wooden hand grip. The shoulder stock was a crude wooden frame they built themselves. The whole thing was held together with clamps, solder, and sheer force of will. It was ugly, it was clumsy, it looked, as someone remarked, like a piece of plumbing. The projectile was just as improvised. They took the warhead from the M6A3 grenade and attached it to the body of one of Skinner's 2.36-inch smoke rockets. The marriage was not perfect, the balance was off, but it was a complete, self-propelled, shaped charge munition. The test was a secret. They took their contraption out to a remote part of the proving ground, far from the official firing ranges. Ull held the tube. Skinner loaded the rocket into the back. There was no manual, no doctrine. Ull, on instinct, hoisted the tube onto his shoulder, a position that seemed to offer the most stability. Skinner stood behind him, ready to make a note of what happened. Ull aimed at a pile of sandbags and pulled the trigger. The result was a terrifying success. There was a deafening roar, and a huge cloud of smoke and dust erupted from the back of the tube. The projectile shot out of the front with a loud whoosh, trailing a thin ribbon of smoke, and slammed into the sandbags, detonating with a sharp crack. The tube was intact, and Ull, to his profound relief, was not on fire. The backblast, while ferocious, was a cone of pressure and gas that was lethal to anyone standing behind it, but perfectly safe for the operator. They had done it. They had created a recoilless gun. The "it works" moment needed to be seen. Skinner, using what little influence he had, managed to schedule an official demonstration, but he was intentionally vague about what was being shown. He listed it on the schedule as a test of a new type of rocket-propelled grenade. In May 1942, another group of high-ranking officers, including the chief of the Army Ground Forces Development Section, gathered at Aberdeen. The official purpose of their visit was to see yet another demonstration of the failed M10 rifle grenade. The mood was sour. The program was a disaster, and they were preparing to cancel it. After the rifle grenade failed once again to impress, Skinner stepped forward. He announced they had an unofficial, experimental device to show them. Out walked Edward Ull, carrying the 60-inch metal tube. There was a moment of confused silence, then a ripple of laughter. A general demanded to know what in God's name the stovepipe was. Skinner calmly explained that it was a man-portable rocket launcher. The skepticism in the air was thick enough to taste. A moving target was brought out onto the range, a captured Italian light tank driven remotely. It rumbled across the field at 15 miles per hour. The generals watched, their arms crossed, expecting another embarrassing failure. Skinner loaded a live rocket into the back of the tube Ull was holding on his shoulder. Because they had forgotten to add a proper sight, Skinner crouched behind Ull and aimed at himself, looking down the length of the pipe. He told Ull to adjust his aim. When he was satisfied, he tapped Ole on the head. Ole pulled the trigger. The roar of the backblast made the generals flinch. The rocket leaped from the tube, a small, dark streak against the sky. It seemed to move with an almost lazy slowness. For a second, it looked like it was going to miss. Then it dipped and struck the moving tank squarely on the side of its turret. The explosion was not large. It was a sharp, vicious flash of white-hot light. A cloud of black smoke momentarily obscured the target. When it cleared, the tank was still moving. A groan of disappointment went through the assembled officers. The thing had failed. But then, the tank's turret hatch, which had been closed, suddenly popped open. A thick billow of black, acrid smoke poured out, as if from a furnace. The tank rolled to a stop, its engine dead. There was a profound, stunned silence on the firing range. The generals walked, then ran toward the silent machine. They crowded around it, staring at the point of impact. There was a small, perfectly circular hole, no bigger than a quarter, melted through the 2-inch thick steel plate of the turret. Inside, the crew compartment was a blackened, incinerated charnel house, the metal walls scored and melted by the jet of plasma. In that instant, everything changed. The laughter was gone. The skepticism was gone. The laws of physics, as the Ordnance Department understood them, had been repealed. The toy, the stovepipe, the plumber's nightmare had just killed a moving tank in a single shot. One of the generals, his face a mask of disbelief, turned to Skinner and said simply, "We want that thing, and we want it now." The impossible idea, born from 2 failures and a pile of scrap, had just become the American Army's highest priority weapon. The successful test did not create a weapon, it created a problem wrapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. The strange, ugly tube, born of scrap and heresy, now needed a name, a stock number, a place within the vast and rigid architecture of the United States Army. It was christened the Launcher Rocket Anti-Tank M1, a name as bland and uninspired as the weapon itself was revolutionary, and with that name came the full, crushing weight of the system. The generals who had witnessed the miracle on the firing range wanted the weapon immediately. Their demand, a simple, powerful imperative, echoed down the chain of command and slammed into the institutional fortress of the Ordnance Department. Here, the euphoria of the test curdled into a slow, grinding process of resistance. The department, forced to accept the existence of this bizarre contraption, now began to fight a war of attrition against it. A battle fought not with guns, but with memoranda and specifications. The champion of this resistance was a man who embodied the old faith. Colonel Leslie Studler was a senior officer in the Ordnance Department, a man of immaculate uniforms and deeply held convictions. His world was one of precision engineering, of ballistics tables, of the beautiful, predictable mathematics of the high-velocity gun. He saw war as a contest of applied physics, and the M1 launcher was, to him, an offense against those laws. It was a crude, almost magical device. It did not rely on the noble principles of mass and velocity, but on a secretive chemical trick. It was, in his view, an ungentlemanly weapon, a piece of gutter technology. His opposition was not loud or dramatic. It was a campaign of quiet, persistent doubt. He did not question that the weapon worked on a sunny afternoon at Aberdeen. He questioned whether it would work in the mud and rain of a real battlefield. He summoned Captain Skinner to his office, a room of polished wood and framed photographs of enormous artillery pieces. He did not offer congratulations. He offered a clinical, dispassionate interrogation. He asked about the shelf life of the solid rocket propellant. What happened if it got wet? How stable was it under the vibration of transport? He pointed out the pathetic inadequacy of the firing mechanism, the flimsy wires, the reliance on a common battery that a soldier might forget to replace, or that would surely fail in the cold. He spoke of the lack of a proper optical sight, of the impossibility of training a man to accurately judge the looping, slow-motion trajectory of the rocket. He saved his most potent venom for the backblast. He painted a vivid picture for his superiors of infantrymen huddled in a foxhole or a narrow street, incinerating their comrades who were standing behind them. He envisioned the huge flash and cloud of smoke, instantly giving away the soldier's position to every machine gunner and mortar crew within a mile. This was not a weapon, he argued. It was a suicide device, a clumsy, dangerous gimmick that would get more of our own men killed than the enemy's. He was the voice of the system, the high priest of the old ways, and his arguments were logical, they were sensible, and they were almost successful in strangling the revolution in its cradle. But the clock was ticking too loud. The reports from North Africa were a constant, bloody drumbeat of failure. The demand from the field could not be ignored. A compromise was reached. The Ordnance Department would oversee the production, but it would be a rush job. The M1 launcher was designated a limited procurement item, a stopgap measure, not a permanent addition to the American arsenal. It was a weapon born under a cloud of official disapproval. The contract for mass production was given to General Electric, where Edward Uhl now found himself leading a team in a frantic race against time. The elegant simplicity of the prototype was now a production nightmare. There was no time for refinement, no time for extensive testing. Thousands of steel tubes were cut and welded. Thousands of crude wooden shoulder stocks were hammered together. The ignition system, still little more than a battery in a box, was a constant source of problems. The rockets themselves were a bigger one. The early batches of propellant were unstable, causing some rockets to fly erratically, others to not ignite at all. The fins were flimsy and easily bent, which could send the projectile tumbling end over end. The result was an orphan weapon. Crates of these new M1 launchers, which soldiers on the production line had already nicknamed the Bazooka for its vague resemblance to a popular radio comedian's gaspipe musical instrument, began to arrive at army depots in the spring of 1943. They were a logistical anomaly. They came with a hastily printed manual filled with technical drawings that were nearly incomprehensible to the average sergeant. And they came with no doctrine. No one knew what to do with them. They were not rifles to be issued to every man. They were not crew-served machine guns or mortars with a designated team and a place in the company's table of organization. They were something new, something strange. Who should carry them? Who should be trained to use them? The infantry schools had no instructors, no training program. The bazooka was a weapon without a home, a tool without a trade. For months, thousands of them sat in their wooden crates in warehouses in England and North Africa, a solution to a problem that no one on the ground knew how to use. The system had accepted the weapon's existence, but it was doing its best to ignore it. The plan seemed to be to let it fade into obscurity, to be replaced in a year or two by a proper, respectable anti-tank gun, a weapon designed by the experts, a weapon that obeyed the laws of physics. But the war would not wait for the system to catch up. The advocate the bazooka needed was not an engineer or a scientist, it was a warrior. In North Africa, in the wake of the Kasserine Pass disaster, a new commander had been given the shattered remnants of the American Second Corps. His name was George S. Patton, Jr. He was a man who understood the soul of an army, and he knew his army's soul was sick with fear. A deep, primal fear of the German Panzer. He had seen it in the eyes of his men, in the way they dug their foxholes deeper, in the way they flinched at the sound of any engine. It was a psychological disease, a form of combat paralysis, and he knew it was more dangerous than any German gun. Patton was a cavalryman, a student of history, but he was no fool for tradition. He was a ruthless pragmatist. He knew his 37mm guns were useless. He knew his tank destroyers were too slow to react. He was facing the invasion of Sicily, an amphibious assault against an island defended by battle-hardened German armored units, including the formidable Hermann Göring Panzer Division. He needed a cure for the sickness of tank fear, and he needed it now. He heard about the bazooka. The reports that reached his desk were a confused mix of official skepticism from the ordnance men and wild, almost unbelievable rumors from the testing grounds. He was shown the pictures of the neat, small hole melted through the captured tank's turret. He did not care about the unstable propellant or the flimsy fins. He did not care about Colonel Studler's warnings about backblast. He saw the hole. That was all that mattered. He saw a weapon that could empower a single man to destroy a 60-ton behemoth. He saw a weapon that could turn fear into aggression. He saw a talisman. This was the gamble. Patton sent a cable to the War Department that was not a request, but a demand. He wanted every M1 launcher available in the theater of operations. He wanted them delivered to his divisions immediately. He wanted them for Operation Husky. The system pushed back. The cables that flew back and forth across the Atlantic were electric with bureaucratic panic. He was told the weapon was not ready for general issue. It was still classified as experimental. He was warned that the troops were not trained in its use, that its deployment would be premature and dangerous. He was, in effect, being told to wait, to follow the procedure, to let the system work its course. Patton's reply was a thunderclap of insubordination. He made it clear that he did not have time for the system. He made the damn the rules decision that would seal the bazooka's fate. He said he would take the launchers and the ammunition, and his men would learn how to use them on the transport ships crossing the Mediterranean to Sicily. They would read the incomprehensible manuals. They would conduct dry fire drills on the crowded decks. Their first live fire practice would be against a live German tank on a Sicilian beach. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. He was arming his soldiers for the largest amphibious invasion in history with a weapon that had never been tested in combat, a weapon many of his own army's experts considered a death trap, and a weapon his men would have, at best, a few hours of passing familiarity with before being thrown into battle. He was betting the lives of his soldiers and the success of the entire Italian campaign on an ugly piece of stovepipe that a handful of heretics had built out of junk. The system had no choice but to yield. The crates were broken open. The launchers and their strange finned rockets were loaded onto the ships of the invasion fleet. They were handed out to young infantrymen who looked at the bizarre object with a mixture of fear and wonder. They were told this was the new tank killer. They were told it was their answer to the Panzer. As the Great Armada steamed toward the coast of Sicily, thousands of American soldiers, boys from a country that had never been invaded, held in their hands a weapon born of desperation. The colonel's warnings, the captain's obsession, the engineer's flash of insight, it all came down to this. The theory was about to be tested in the unforgiving laboratory of war. The gamble was on. The beaches of Sicily were not sand. They were a fine gray gravel that sucked at a man's boots, a mixture of volcanic ash and ancient stone that promised no easy purchase. The pre-dawn of July 10, 1943 was a chaos of noise and confusion. The air was thick with the smells of salt, diesel exhaust, and human vomit. The rhythmic, grinding crunch of landing craft ramps dropping onto the shore was punctuated by the flat crack of German rifles and the hysterical, ripping sound of MG-42 machine guns firing from pillboxes hidden in the low dunes. For the men of the 45th Infantry Division wading through the cold, waist-deep surf, this was the moment the theory of war ended. They were National Guardsmen from Oklahoma and the Southwest, men who had trained in dusty camps for a moment they could never have truly imagined. They carried their rifles high, their faces pale and taut in the flickering light of distant explosions. They were fighting for every inch of ground, for a toehold on Fortress Europe. And then, the sound returned. The sound from Kasserine Pass. The deep, guttural growl of heavy engines. It began as a vibration felt through the soles of their wet boots, a low thrumming that was distinct from the random percussion of the battle. It grew steadily, a predator's announcement. From the narrow lanes that wound down from the island's interior, the counterattack came. They were Panzers of the Hermann Göring Division, an elite, battle-hardened unit that had fought on the Eastern Front. They were not the sun-bleached veterans of the Afrika Korps. These were machines of a different order. Panzer IVs, their long guns menacing, but also something new, something bigger, a tiger. A single, monstrous Panzerkampfwagen 6, its hull a solid wall of angled steel. Its 88mm cannon a weapon of almost mythical power. It moved with the ponderous, unstoppable authority of a landslide. This was the arrogant advance. The German commanders, observing the fragile American beachhead, saw what they expected to see. An infantry assault, thinly spread, lacking heavy support, its back to the sea. They saw the perfect conditions for a classic armored counterthrust. A quick, brutal punch to drive the invaders back into the water before they could consolidate their gains. The plan was simple: annihilate them. On the beach, the American infantry watched them come. The old fear, the sickness Patton had tried to cure, returned in a cold wave. The few 37mm guns they had managed to get ashore fired their useless, sparking shots. The Panzers ignored them. They rolled forward, their machine guns chattering, scything down the exposed American soldiers who had nowhere to hide. The Tiger, the centerpiece of the assault, fired its main gun. The shell did not explode. It was an armor-piercing round, aimed at a wrecked landing craft. The solid shot passed through the thin steel of the boat as if it were paper, and detonated in the ammunition stockpile behind it. The secondary explosion was a titanic, deafening roar that threw men from their feet and hammered the beach with shrapnel. The German attack was not a battle, it was an execution. In a shallow ditch scraped into the gravel behind a low seawall, Sergeant Frank Peterson lay with his two-man team. He was a former garage mechanic from Tulsa, a man who understood engines and the simple, brutal logic of machines. And the logic of the machines coming toward him was that he and everyone around him were about to die. He had a Thompson submachine gun, a weapon he loved for its solid, mechanical violence. Against the steel plate of a Panzer, it was a noisemaker. But he had something else. Lying beside him in the ditch was the tube, the launcher rocket M1, the bazooka. He and his loader, a skinny kid from Enid named Charlie, had been given the thing on the ship. They had sat through a hurried lecture by a fresh-faced lieutenant who seemed to know less about it than they did. They had fumbled with the awkward wooden stock and the strange finned rockets. They had memorized the warnings about the backblast, the dire predictions of what would happen to anyone foolish enough to stand behind it. It felt less like a weapon and more like a piece of industrial equipment, something you would use to clear a clogged pipe. Charlie held one of the rockets. It felt flimsy, the fins made of thin sheet metal that bent if you looked at it too hard. He looked at the advancing Panzers, then at the tube. He told Frank he did not think this was going to work. Frank, his own heart a cold, tight knot in his chest, did not reply. He just watched the lead Panzer, a Mark IV, as it swiveled its turret to spray the dunes with machine gun fire. It was less than 200 yards away. From inside the cupola of that Panzer, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter surveyed the beach with contemptuous satisfaction. His optics filled with the sight of the American infantry, scrambling for cover, dying in the open. His crew was efficient, professional. They had done this 100 times in Russia. This was easier. The Americans were soft. They had no stomach for this kind of war. Then his gunner's voice crackled over the intercom. He pointed out a new sight. 2 soldiers in a ditch near the seawall. One of them was hoisting a long, dark tube onto his shoulder. Richter focused his binoculars. He saw the strange, clumsy weapon. He had been briefed on rumors of a new American anti-tank rifle, but this was not a rifle. It was a pipe. He laughed. He told his gunner the Americans were getting desperate. First the door knocker guns, now this. The Ofenrohr, the stovepipe. It was pathetic. A toy. He ordered his driver to continue the advance. He told the gunner to ignore the men with the pipe and concentrate on the machine gun nest that was trying to suppress their supporting infantry. The new weapon was not a threat. It was a curiosity, a joke to be told later, over wine. This was the moment, the new, unproven tactic unleashed. Frank Peterson settled the crude wooden stock of the bazooka against his shoulder. He felt the grit of the gravel digging into his elbows. He could feel Charlie's hand on his back as the loader inserted the rocket into the rear of the tube and connected the ignition wire. The procedure felt clumsy, academic, utterly insane in the face of the approaching tank. Charlie slapped him on the helmet, the signal that the weapon was armed. He shouted the warning, "Backblast," and scrambled to the side. Frank was alone, the weight of the tube suddenly immense. The Panzer filled his entire world, a rumbling 25-ton wall of steel. Through the simple iron sight, a primitive metal notch, he tried to draw a bead on the tank's hull. The manual had said to aim for the tracks or the rear armor, but all he could see was the front. He remembered the diagram of the shaped charge, the picture of the molten jet. It was not a bullet. It was chemistry. It was magic. He put the sight on the center of the hull, took a breath that did not fill his lungs, and squeezed the trigger. There was no kick, no familiar, violent shove against his shoulder. There was just a loud, shocking whoosh, and a violent blast of hot gas and dust erupted from the back of the tube, kicking up a cloud of gravel that stung Charlie's face. For an instant, Frank was deafened and blinded. The rocket leaped from the launcher. It was not a streaking, supersonic bullet. It flew with a strange, almost drunken slowness, trailing a tail of gray smoke. It looks like a firework, underpowered and ridiculous. Inside the Panzer, Klaus Richter, annoyed by the cloud of dust, was about to yell at his driver when his gunner screamed a single word, "Rocket!" Richter saw it through his own periscope, a small, dark object arcing toward them. He had time to register its pathetic speed, time to feel a flicker of amusement. Then it hit. The impact was not a deafening clang of steel on steel. It was a sharp, almost surgical crack, like a giant whip. A brilliant, searing flash of white light, no bigger than a fist, appeared on the frontal glacis plate. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The Panzer continued to roll forward. Then the laws of physics were rewritten. The hypervelocity jet of molten copper, traveling at 5 miles per second, passed through 4 inches of hardened German steel as if it were cheese. Inside the crew compartment, the universe was transformed into a sun. The air itself ignited. The ammunition stored in the hull flash-cooked, and the Panzer detonated from within. The turret, weighing several tons, was blown clean off the chassis, thrown 30 feet into the air to land upside down in the surf with a great splash. The hull erupted into a geyser of oily black flame. The confident, arrogant advance of the lead Panzer had ended in a sudden, catastrophic act of mechanical annihilation. On the beach, the firing stopped. Americans and Germans alike stared in stunned silence at the burning wreck. The bafflement inside the other Panzers was total. The commander of the second tank, Richter's wingman, had seen the whole thing. He had seen the puff of smoke from the ditch. He had seen the slow-moving rocket, and he had seen his commander's tank vaporized. It made no sense. It was not artillery. There had been no muzzle flash from a large gun. It had come from the infantry, from the toy stovepipe. His radio crackled with panicked questions from the other tankers. What was that? Where had it come from? Their perfect, well-oiled system had just encountered a variable for which it had no answer. Their tactical doctrine had no paragraph for this. The confusion became panic. Frank Peterson, his ears ringing, his mind a blank slate of shock and adrenaline, was fumbling with the launcher. Charlie was already there, shoving another rocket into the tube. He did not need to be told. The fear was gone, replaced by a wild, electrifying sense of power. They had done it. The monster could bleed. The second Panzer, its commander frozen by indecision, became a sitting target. Frank hoisted the tube again. This time, his hands were steady. He aimed, not for the hull, but for the turret, just below the commander's cupola. He fired. The second rocket flew true. It struck the turret ring, the weak point where the turret meets the hull. The shaped charge did its work, welding the two pieces of metal together with a flash of incandescent heat. The tank was not destroyed, but it was crippled, its turret frozen, its main gun useless. The crew, trapped inside a steel coffin that was rapidly filling with smoke, bailed out, tumbling from the escape hatches and running for their lives, cut down by the rifles of the suddenly emboldened American infantry. 1 minute had not yet passed since the first shot. The Tiger was now the lead element. Its commander, a veteran of Kursk, was a professional. He saw the threat. He ordered his gunner to fire a high-explosive shell at the ditch by the seawall. The 88mm cannon boomed, a sound of divine wrath. The shell landed exactly where Frank Peterson and his loader had been moments before. The ditch, the seawall, everything vanished in a crater of blasted earth. But Peterson and Charlie were already gone, scrambling 50 yards down the beach to a new position behind the wreckage of a jeep. And they were not alone anymore. All along the American line, other two-man teams, who had watched the first 2 kills with wide-eyed disbelief, were unlimbering their own bazookas. The secret was out. The talisman worked. The third Panzer, a Mark IV, trying to swing wide to flank the burning wrecks, exposed its thinner side armor. A rocket, fired by a corporal from another company who had never even held a bazooka until that morning, slammed into its engine compartment. The tank lurched to a stop, thick, greasy smoke pouring from its rear vents. A moment later, its fuel tank caught, and it too was burning. 3 Panzers, the spearhead of the German assault, neutralized in less than 60 seconds by a handful of infantrymen with a weapon that had been dismissed as a joke. The German attack broke. It did not falter, it shattered. The remaining Panzers, including the terrifying Tiger, fired a few last angry shots and then reversed, churning the gravel as they retreated back up the narrow lanes away from the beach. They had come to execute a helpless enemy. They had found an enemy that could kill them from any foxhole, an enemy whose individual soldiers now wielded the power of an anti-tank gun. The psychological equation of the battlefield had been inverted. The hunter had become the hunted. On the beach, among the craters and the bodies, the American soldiers slowly rose to their feet. They looked at the 3 pillars of black smoke rising into the Sicilian sky. They looked at the simple, ugly tubes of steel and wood in their hands. The weapon had been proven. Patton's gamble had paid off. The toy had become a giant slayer, and the fear was gone. The first reports that reached the German command headquarters in Sicily were dismissed as battlefield hysteria. They were fragmented, panicked accounts from the surviving panzer crews of the Hermann Göring division, stories that bordered on the surreal. They spoke of American infantrymen shouldering stovepipes, of rockets that moved with impossible slowness, and of tanks being destroyed by a weapon that made no sound of a conventional gun. The German officers, men who understood the rigid physics of anti-tank warfare, assumed their troops were shell-shocked, mistaking artillery or naval gunfire for something new. A weapon that could be carried by one man and kill a panzer head-on was not just new, it was a violation of the known laws of war. The hysteria, however, did not subside. It grew. More panzers were lost in the brutal fighting for the island's rugged interior. The stories became more consistent. The weapon was real. It was everywhere. Every American infantry platoon seemed to have one. The psychological effect was devastating. German tank crews, who had once advanced with an untouchable sense of superiority, now saw every ditch, every ruined building, every hedgerow as a potential ambush site. The American GI was no longer just a target. He was a potential tank killer. The fear that had paralyzed the Americans at Kasserine Pass had crossed the lines and infected the German Panzerwaffe. The proof arrived a few weeks into the campaign. A German patrol, counterattacking a captured village, overran an American position and found one of the strange launchers left behind in the chaos of the retreat. It was sent immediately to the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Ordnance Department in Berlin. There, in the clean, well-lit laboratories of German military science, the engineers unpacked the crude American weapon. Their initial reaction was one of professional disdain. It was so primitive. The tube was rough. The wooden furniture was clumsy. The ignition system was a joke of wires and batteries, something a hobbyist would build. It had none of the elegant precision engineering of a German weapon. But then they examined the rocket. They cut open the warhead and saw the carefully machined copper cone of the shaped charge, and they understood. The contempt turned to a cold, grudging admiration. The Americans, in their typical artless brute force way, had stumbled upon a moment of profound genius. They had bypassed the entire problem of high-velocity ballistics. They had taken a chemical principle and married it to the simplest possible delivery system. It was not a gun. It was a disposable cannon that threw a self-propelled mine. And it was cheap. They could make thousands of them. The emergency countermeasure was immediate and draconian. New tactical doctrine was rushed to the front. Tank crews were ordered to advance only with heavy infantry support, their Schützen sweeping the ground ahead for any sign of the American stovepipe teams. They were trained to fire high-explosive shells and machine guns at any suspected position, to saturate the battlefield with fire to suppress the bazooka men before they could get a shot off. On the tanks themselves, mechanics began welding on extra steel plates and hanging spare track links, a desperate, improvised attempt to detonate the shaped charge before it could touch the primary armor. Later, they would add thin steel skirts, the famous Schürzen, to their Panzers, a direct response to this new threat. A single, simple weapon had forced a wholesale change in the tactics and design of the most powerful armored force in the world. And in the laboratories, the German engineers, with the full and enthusiastic approval of a high command now terrified of this new weapon, began their own project. It was not innovation, it was plagiarism. They copied the American design, but they made it German. The tube was widened to fire a larger, more powerful 88mm rocket. The simple battery ignition was replaced with a more reliable magneto system. The sights were improved. The result was the Raketen Panzerwaffe of 54, a weapon so feared by the Allies it was known by its sinister nickname, the Panzer Schreck, the terror of the tank. It was a bigger, heavier, more powerful bazooka, but its soul was American. The ultimate testament to the success of the crude stovepipe was that its most dangerous enemy immediately stole the idea. The men who had started it all never received a parade. There were no newsreels heralding the inventors of the weapon that had saved the infantrymen. Their contribution was buried under layers of official classification and the simple, grinding anonymity of the war effort. Leslie Skinner, the rocket heretic, continued his work. The success of the bazooka had given his fringe science a sudden, violent legitimacy. He was promoted, given more resources, and played a key role in the development of the larger, more powerful rockets that would arm American fighter planes and artillery units later in the war. After the war, he stayed with the Army, a respected but still obscure figure at the Ordnance Rocket Development Center at Redstone Arsenal, the very place that would later give birth to the American space program. He had helped launch a revolution, and then simply continued his work in the quiet of the laboratory. Edward Uhl, the young civilian engineer, left government service after the war. He returned to the private sector, his mind already turning to new problems. He joined an engineering firm and rose through the corporate ranks, eventually becoming the president of Fairchild Aircraft, a major defense contractor. He became a man of boardrooms and balance sheets, a captain of industry. Few of his colleagues knew that as a young man, he had stood on a firing range holding a piece of scrap pipe, and by pulling a simple trigger, had fundamentally changed the balance of power on the ground. For both Skinner and Uhl, the bazooka was not a monument. It was a problem they had solved, a moment of intense creative pressure that had defined their war, before they moved on to the next problem. They were the perfect unlikely heroes, men who had provided the answer and then quietly stepped back, letting the answer speak for itself. The moral of the stovepipe is a profound and enduring one. It is a story about the true nature of power on a battlefield. For a generation, military thinkers had been seduced by the machine, by the seemingly unstoppable power of the tank. The Panzer, the Tiger, the Sherman, these were the new gods of war, and the infantryman was reduced to the role of a helpless supplicant. The bazooka was an act of profound theological rebellion. It taught the humbling lesson that the dominance of any single weapon system is always temporary. It proved that a simple, cheap, and widely distributed countermeasure can defeat a complex, expensive, and powerful weapon. It was the great equalizer. The Ordnance Department, with its rigid faith in the gospel of muzzle velocity, had suffered a failure of imagination. They were trying to solve the problem of the tank by building a better tank, a bigger gun. They believed the answer lay in escalation, in a brute force contest of physics. Skinner and Uhl had looked at the problem from a different angle entirely. They did not try to defeat the tank's armor. They bypassed it. Their solution was not about physics, it was about chemistry. It was a lateral thought, an idea from outside the established doctrine, and that is why it was so powerful. It proved that the man on the ground, the soldier in the foxhole, is not an obstacle to be managed by the real weapons. He is the central actor. Give him the right tool and he can change the course of a battle. The bazooka was more than a weapon. It was an argument. It was an argument that ingenuity can defeat mass, that a clever idea is more powerful than a thick plate of steel, and that the courage of a single soldier, when properly armed, is the most decisive force in war. And so, the full circle. The unauthorized idea, born in a junk pile and tested in secret, is now the foundation of modern infantry combat. The M1 bazooka was a crude beginning, plagued with problems, but the concept was perfect. After Sicily, its production was accelerated, its design refined. The flimsy ignition system was replaced with a magneto. A simple optical sight was added. The M9 bazooka was a far more reliable and effective weapon, and it became a ubiquitous presence on every front, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific. In the frozen mountains of Korea, its successor, the M20 Super Bazooka, with its larger 3.5-inch rocket, would be the only weapon an American GI had that could stop the thick-skinned Soviet-built T-34 tanks. But its truest legacy is its children. The idea of a man-portable, shoulder-fired, shaped-charge rocket launcher was too powerful to remain an American monopoly. The German Panzerschreck was the first copy. After the war, the Soviets, who had captured thousands of both bazookas and Panzerschrecks, developed their own. The RPG-2, and later its legendary descendant, the RPG-7, became the most prolific anti-tank weapon in history. The symbol of the insurgent, the guerrilla, the David against the Goliath of the modern armored state. From Vietnam to Afghanistan to Ukraine, the essential drama of the Sicilian beach has been replayed 1,000,000 times. A soldier, crouched in a ditch, holding a simple tube, waiting for a tank. Today, the bazooka's descendants are an essential, non-negotiable part of every infantry squad in every modern army. The American M72 Law, the Swedish AT4, the British N-Law, they are all direct ideological heirs of the M1. They are lighter, more powerful, made of fiberglass and composites instead of steel and wood, but their soul is the same. They are the embodiment of the principle that was laughed at by the ordnance colonels and the German Panzer commanders, that every soldier must have the power to kill a tank. The toy, the stovepipe, the plumber's nightmare, is now the bedrock of doctrine. The desperate gamble Patton made on the ships to Sicily is now the standard, universally accepted assumption of how wars are fought and won. The quiet work of the heretic and the tinkerer, the men who saw a solution where the experts saw only an impossibility, echoes today in the roar of every shoulder-fired rocket. They did not just invent a weapon, they invented the modern infantryman.